Okay, lesson 4 deals with the terms of the other peace treaties. What a lot of people tend to forget when we get into it, the topic, the peace treaties, the big three, the end of World War I, is that the Treaty of Versailles was one of only of 5 different treaties, in fact, that dealt with Germany specifically. Germany had allies, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, Turkey, to name a few, and the allies had the job of, well, working on the Treaty of Versailles, dealing with all of the other countries simultaneously. And sometimes they would do that simultaneously, and in some cases they would wait till after the initial treaty was negotiated with Germany, and then move on to some of the, I won't call them lesser powers, but countries that whose involvement perhaps weren't as significant as Germany. There are a number of peace treaties that we'll work on and we'll work through in this particular lesson. You'll be happy to know it's not going to take very long. You will also probably be interested to know, however, that up until 2016, the terms of the other peace treaties had never been asked in an exam by Cambridge on the CIE course. That changed drastically in 2016, and the terms of the peace treaties regarding Austria-Hungary for once, and not to mention the peace treaty that dealt with Turkey, were examined in the form of 6-mark questions. So this, I believe, is a part of the specification for this particular topic that Cambridge realizes had been overlooked and will be examined, I would assume, pretty regularly going forward. So you do need to know this stuff. The Treaty of Versailles obviously is centrally important to this course. However, this part will be examined. And you can count on that, so do pay attention and do make sure you understand what's being said here. And it's not that complicated, let's be honest. So, as I mentioned, the lost in the focus and lost in the haze that people put on the settlement with Germany is the fact that the peacemakers made other treaties, and they did so, like I said, after, in some cases, the Treaty of Versailles had been negotiated, but in some cases, up to 3 years afterwards. That didn't mean the big three stayed in Paris. Most of them went home in the summer of 1919, but they left large contingents, representatives, if you will, whose job it was to represent the country and negotiate the peace treaty with the powers outside of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Now, the treaties that were signed with Germany's allies were very, very similar in many ways with the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles was the focus point and therefore made the basis of all other treaties that were signed. These treaties had things like the war guilt clause. Everyone also had an obligation to pay reparations. They also had enforced on those countries a reduction in armaments. In other words, that they could not and should not be able to field large militaries like they had before 1914. And every one of these countries had to accept the League of Nations and its covenant or constitution. Where these treaties differ, the treaties that deal with Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, Turkey, etc., is in their provision of territory, land. And we're going to examine the differences, assuming that all 4 of those things are the same. We're going to examine the differences when we look at each one of those treaties. The treaty that dealt with Austria. Austria, of course, is separated, the empire, it crumbles, and the treaty that deals with what's left of the heart of that empire, the country of Austria, was known as the Treaty of Saint-Germain. You'll also notice that if you ever visit Paris, all of the treaties are named for different areas in Paris, principally where the meetings were held to negotiate those treaties. So Saint-Germain, beautiful area, really lovely area, and it's just south of the Seine in Paris, very bohemian, lots of art, lots of culture, great cafes, several of my favorite restaurants I've ever eaten at, but that's neither here nor there, and quite a romantic place if you ever find yourself there down the road with your wife or your husband. Take a walk through Saint-Germain, you'll quite like it. It is also the location of one of France's top universities. Now, you don't have to write this down. This is just merely Mr. Rain being interesting. The Sorbonne. And the Sorbonne is actually, interestingly enough, where the Treaty of Saint-Germain talks were held. Now, all that said, what did that treaty say about Austria? Number one, it created Austria. Austria had been the owner, the co-owner, if you will, with Hungary, of a large empire that extended up mostly through Central and Southern Eastern Europe. And this empire was broken up, and Austria had to accept that. They had to accept that they were principally going to be a small, landlocked country in the center of Europe. They had to recognize the independence of the countries they used to control: Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland. Territory from their former empire was given to create the new Czech superstate, Czechoslovakia. Poland, reunification of Poland, that's something that hadn't been so since the Middle Ages. Yugoslavia, a Slav superstate, principally dominated by Serbia. Romania and Italy also took pieces of what was once the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Austria goes from being a great empire to a small landlocked nation, and it's surrounded by hostile states. Don't forget that the war starts with Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Now Serbia is not only the sort of part of Yugoslavia, it is really the dominant factor in Yugoslavia and despises the Austrians. The Italians are more powerful and despise the Austrians. So Austria is really in a precarious position. As such, something that had gone around in Austria for, well, realistically hundreds of years was the idea that Germany and Austria should be one country. But, you know, during the time of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, broadly speaking, it was accepted that Austria could remain separate from Germany, even though they're both German-speaking peoples, both powerful countries in a separate part of Europe, because Austria's ruling family, the Habsburgs, were so powerful and very much independent of the Hohenzollern family. Of the German royal line. Anyhow, make a long story short, after World War I, when all of that was for naught, the Habsburgs are gone, and Austria becomes a republic without a king. Most people in Austria actually overwhelmingly favored unification of the German states of Austria and Germany, and this was forbidden in principle in both the Treaty of Saint-Germain, and as you know, Anschluss was also forbidden in the Treaty of Versailles. And for many Austrians, this was something they wouldn't get over, a pill that was difficult to swallow, of course, and it does, as they will remind you over and over and over, if you are a statesman from France or a statesman from Britain or a statesman from America, this violates the principle of self-determination outlined in Wilson's 14 points. So this is what Austria looks like now. You can see what was the former empire and what was broken off of it. The larger outline of those colored areas, not the parts in yellow that is, was what was the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you'll have to look within to see exactly where Austria sits. It's gone from being quite a big empire to quite a small one. And for the most part, actually, these are the borders of Austria today. So in many ways, the Treaty of Saint-Germain very much has a lasting effect in Austria. Hungary, Austria's other ally, was the recipient of the Treaty of Trianon, signed almost a year after the Treaty of Versailles. The main points of this, again, apart from the four I mentioned earlier, are the fact that Hungary, too, had to accept the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They, too, had to recognize the independence of Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia. They also had territory taken from it, and they had areas that were part of Hungary given to Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and additionally Romania. Hungary lost 70% of its territory, in fact, and 1/3 of its population. So for Hungarians, the Treaty of Versailles was a very open wound, and this makes sense in many ways when you consider that the Hungarians allied themselves with the Nazis, very much on the principle of overturning the beastly Treaty of Trianon forced on them at the end of World War I. So they very much look towards the Nazis for I don't know, help and ally themselves with the Nazis, disastrously so, obviously, but in World War II. Hungary, too, is deprived of seaports and is now an entirely landlocked nation in the middle of Europe. And why are seaports important for that matter? Well, if you manufacture something, the best way to get lots and lots of goods around the world to sell is to put them on boats. And without the access to the seaport, this is increasingly more expensive, as you have to train your goods to the nearest seaport and then pay the duties or the fees charged by the country that owns the seaport for you to use it. So it puts Hungary at an economic disadvantage. So we see how Hungary was broken up here in this photo, which shows the dismemberment of Hungary. See the bits that were given to Romania, Czechoslovakia, and what is left is, again, is quite a small piece of Hungary right in the middle center of Europe, with Budapest as its core. Bulgaria, a lot of people forget that Bulgaria, of course, allied itself with Germany. It was a recipient of the Treaty of Neuilly, signed on 27 November 1919. This, again, has the same 4 points as the rest, but they too have to recognize the independence of Yugoslavia. Bulgaria will lose territory to Greece, Yugoslavia, and Romania. For Bulgarians, they took it pretty hard. In fact, Bulgaria, in many ways, never recovers. And there's an interesting sense of angry Bulgarian nationalism. And again, too, the Bulgarian side of the Nazis in World War II to overthrow this treaty. And what you get is sort of, they basically recognize the fact that the treaty is the end of a 40-year struggle. The Bulgarians had expanded greatly around the turn of the century, taking land from what was then the collapsing Ottoman Empire of Turkey. Turkey was known as the sick empire of Europe, and the Bulgarians exploited that in the years up to World War I to increase the Bulgarian territory. A lot of this territory was hacked away. The loss of this land was a blow to the national pride of Bulgaria, and for many people, they saw a country with a very uncertain future. So you see the areas here that were taken. Now, it doesn't look as big, but of course the importance of these areas to the Bulgarians can't be understated. As you can see from the wonderful picture on the right with the skulls representing an area of Bulgaria hacked off by the treaty, you get the idea that the Bulgarians weren't necessarily very pleased. And of course, in that sense, the Nazis found themselves yet another useful ally. Lastly, and probably more complex, the Treaty of Sevres, 10th August 1920, deals with the Turkish Empire, known as the Ottoman Empire. The Turks had fought quite extensively in the First World War on the side of the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. If you're familiar with the Battle of Gallipoli, a lot of people realize that, oh wow, yeah, that's right, we did fight the Turks. Of course, Gallipoli was a big campaign to take land from the Turkish Empire. A lot of the fighting in the Middle East took place in areas that were former parts of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. Of course, if you've seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, or if you're familiar even with early Israeli history, you'll know that the British Mandate in the Middle East starts at the end of World War I because they take over land that was once owned by the Ottoman Empire. And of course, that land includes Jerusalem and what is today the State of Israel. Now, anyways, make a long story short, let's get through Sevres. They have to recognize the independence of Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Hejaz, and Armenia, an area that was subjected to a genocide by the Turks during the First World War, a horrendous genocide. And that's an entirely horrendous story to talk about, actually, and a story for not necessarily for this lesson. But if you want to read about the Armenian genocide and you have a strong constitution, I do recommend it because it is it's one of the forgotten horrors of the 20th century. They lost provinces in the Middle East to Britain and France. They lost Greece to Italy, or lost territory in Greece to Italy. The strait, the Dardanelles Strait, the strait that runs from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, was to become an international waterway. The aforementioned Battle of Gallipoli was all about freeing the Dardanelles Strait from Turkish control. And the Dardanelles Strait runs actually right past the Turkish city of Istanbul, the capital, the capital at that particular point anyway, and Turkey's largest center. So this area was to become an international waterway, which they did not have total control of like they used to. And almost disastrously and interestingly, the Eutherios Venizelos, the Greek prime minister, managed to charm David Lloyd George and persuaded him that the ancient Greek empire in Asia Minor could be reconstituted. And Asia Minor is the area known as the Greek Peninsula. I'll show you in the slide next exactly what I'm talking about. Lloyd George actually gives in to the Greeks and allows the Greeks to go ahead and land troops in an area known as Smyrna on the western coast of Turkey. And he encourages the Greeks to advance inland. The unforeseen consequences of this territorial gain by Greece was the fact that it mobilizes Turkish nationalism under a man named Kemal Ataturk, or simply Ataturk. And they are able to defeat the Greek forces, and the Greek communities that in many cases had existed for centuries along the Turkish coast, in quite good harmony with the Turks, were expelled back to Greece, or the Greeks living in them were killed. And this led to a renegotiation of the Treaty of Sevres. This is something that needed to be resettled. Not to mention the fact that this leads to countless problems between the Turks and the Greeks that really resonate to this day. Now, the area I'm talking about is that little area there where it says Izmir on the Aegean Sea. The Greek islands are those to the left here, and the Greeks were forced to land troops here and expand inland. And the Greek expansion into this area was, let's just say, too much for the Turks. So the Turks recoalesce under the new state of Turkey under Kemal Ataturk and expel them. And they also basically reclaim this whole area, of green and blue. And what happens only a few years later is after, what turns out to be a treaty that leads to endless war. On the 24th of July, 1923, you get the Treaty of Lausanne. And Turkey is brought back to the negotiating table by the Allies in an attempt to stop what has now become 3 years of warfare, or 4 years of warfare, actually, against the Greeks. And they will confirm in this treaty, in respect to the fact that they get the land back that they fought over, the loss of their provinces in the Middle East. They'll receive most of the territory that they lost back from the European powers. The Dardanelles Strait, the one I talked about that runs by Istanbul, was returned to Turkey. They lost restrictions on their armed forces, and they no longer had to pay reparations. Such was the extent of their victory. And of course, Kemal Ataturk becomes a national hero. Anyone flying to Istanbul or have gone on a Turkish holiday has probably found themselves landing in Ataturk Airport, and now you know why. So this is what Turkey looks like at the end of the war after the Treaty of Lausanne in November of 1923. You see all of those areas taken by the Greeks and the Italians that were so controversially taken according to the Turks are gone. And what we have now is a solid Turkish bloc that extends into the northern bit of the Middle East. But you also see where Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, areas of the former Ottoman Empire, not to mention the fact that areas of Bulgaria are taken back as well. The Treaty of Lausanne is in many ways a complete reversal, and it really has to do with the fact that the Treaty of Sevres was so punitive in terms of the land it took back, and so I suppose they so badly misunderstood the situation on the ground there that they had to renegotiate the treaty, and what you get is the Treaty of Lausanne. So those are the treaties that ended the war. And like I said, the peacemakers were not wholly focused on the Treaty of Versailles. They in fact wrote a number of different treaties dealing with all of the Allies. In one case, the Treaty of Sevres, they had to renegotiate this one entirely 4 years later. And what we have here is modern day Turkey, pretty much unchanged. That's the lesson. I'll catch you guys in class.